So, welcome, Andrew, to Keen on Yoga. It's been best part of 2 years, I think, since we chatted before. I think it was a long time ago now, but lovely to have you. And I remember that chat at the time, right? And how much I enjoyed it, actually. So today, Andrew's going to come on. Particularly, we wanted to talk about this Nath Sampradaya that is, I think, the basis of your work really these days, right? This sort of kind of like parampara lineage, yeah.
So Nathamuni Sampradaya is the spiritual tradition that Sri Krishnamacharya came from. So in my curiosity to find out more about where yoga comes from and who's sort of responsible for this yoga that's been a great influence in my life, I've been studying this particular lineage and tradition.
I know you've been studying for all your life, right? I mean, as I remember, your father introduced you to it, and then kind of there you were young, weren't you? Kind of under 20 or something. Yeah. It's insane. Yeah. So, really, I mean, you deserve a lot more renownedness for your work on yoga, I think. So, I mean, trying to get a better handle on this, first of all, for our listenership that might not really know what the Nath or the Sampradaya is, and these terms are becoming more and more popular, in the general yoga sphere. Do you want to kind of clarify? I mean, Sampradaya, we kind of know that's a group, right? That's basically means a group, but the Nath thing is a little bit more complicated because there's a bunch of different Naths, as I understand it, right? There's not just one.
Yeah, right. Like Naths are actually one of the 5 major sects of sadhus, and that's 2 different things. Actually, they're sort of dreadlocks to the ground, ashes of the dead, chillums, and all this. Nathamuni, on the other hand, was one of the acharyas in a particular Vaishnava lineage, and that lineage happens to be the lineage which Sri Krishnamacharya comes from. So in trying to understand, well, where did this yoga come from? The first and most obvious thing is we're doing these postures. Where do these postures come from? How old are they? How do we know? Who said? Who taught it? How do we trace this asana practice? So that leads down a pretty familiar path that kind of dead ends. Krishnamacharya studied with Rama Mohan Brahmacharya, who nobody actually knows anything about, and there's a bunch of conflicting stories, and it pretty much dead ends there. When we want to trace the asana lineage, we roughly end up saying, well, in Tibet, there are a lot of old texts which have quite a lot of hatha yoga asana sequences, and probably it migrated from there. And there is, of course, this, Hatha Vyasa Padati that some very excellent scholars have worked with, Jason Burch and Jim Mallinson. And there's this Yoga Karunta, which we're like 80% sure is Hatha Vyasa Padati, and then still some uncertainty there. But it's kind of been done, and it's kind of, we know what we know about that, and I think new stuff will emerge over time. But what I was sort of interested to look at was, well, who are these people who gave us this practice, and what do they believe? And most Ashtanga practitioners believe in, Padampada, right? We're all part of a Padampada, but we mostly don't know what that actually is. But theoretically, there's some ancient lineage which we are kind of a part of by virtue of doing sun salutations or something to that effect. But what the hell actually is that? And who is it? And so to the best of my studies so far, when you try to trace the asana practice, you kind of hit a dead end at Rama Mohan Brahmacharya, and some speculation about various texts. When you try to study and look at the spiritual tradition that Sri Krishnamacharya came from, it's all crystal clear. It's all right there. All of the people going back 1,000 years are listed, and there are all these acharyas who did various things and wrote various texts. And so this Sampradaya is alive and well in India, Mysore, and my teacher, Lakshmitatachar, was the acharya of that Sampradaya. And when I started, it all started, of course, with making Mysore Yoga Traditions film. And the first thing I thought was, oh my God, these guys are amazing. I want to talk to them as much as possible. Like, how can we learn more from these guys? They know a lot, more than I ever even imagined. Let's try to dig deeper here. And so I started calling him, told him I couldn't quit thinking about him, and that if he would accept my calls, I was going to call. And we had a few sort of awkward conversations, but I asked him to teach me about the Bhagavad Gita, because I knew that was their core text. And so what he started to teach me was called the Gita Sangraha, which is a summary of the Bhagavad Gita written by Yamunacharya roughly 1,000 years ago. And it's 32 verses, and it deals very succinctly with the philosophy of the Gita. So, unfortunately, we didn't make it through that text. He caught COVID and died.
Oh God!
A year ago.
Right.
And I spoke to him like 3 days before.
Right.
And we had a very sweet conversation. But it was a tragic loss for everybody. But now, like all good acharyas, he trained his successor. And so his eldest son is Sri Ime Alwar, and he is now the acharya, and he's also the co-organizer of Mysore Yoga Conference.
Right.
So we just stumbled onto these guys, and I didn't know who they were. You find out who someone is, especially Indian people, over a period of years. If you continue to hear the picture slowly fills in.
Just to clarify to the audience, I mean, Krishnamacharya wasn't an acharya himself of this Nat lineage, was he? He had an acharya, right?
I think it's misleading to say not, because not implies this sect of sadhus.
Okay.
And so there are kapalikas and knots and but Nathamuni Sampradaya, and then there's some other terms for it, but mostly Tatachar always called it Nathamuni Sampradaya. He started telling me the stories and about the tradition right away from the time that I started studying with him. And Krishnamacharya was certainly a member of that lineage. And I don't believe he was an acharya, although his name is
in the list. He's
suspicious. And I call him Tatachar, but Lakshmitatachar Swami Ji is his full title. I know, of course, all these people have huge titles. So yes, and Krishnamacharya wrote Yoga Rahasya, and it was supposed to be a kind of a vision that he had of Nathamuni, and he sort of downloaded this information. And in the Indian worldview, that's legit. In the sort of Western worldview, that's called daydreaming. We have no time for that. But nonetheless, saints and holy people from down through the ages, have had moments of revelation, which they went on to write down or begin to talk about, and other people wrote down. And in the case of the great Tamil sages, most of them actually did not read or write. They just had revelations and talked about them. It was scribes who did pushing. That was not considered the same thing.
And people are born into this lineage, right? You don't kind of join it, right? Like Krishnamacharya was a Vaishnava. He was born with his family into this Nathamuni. Am I getting it right? Nathamuni lineage. And how many? Just get a handle on it. How many people are in this at any one time? Is it a large group of people? And do they have any connection with each other? Do they meet up?
Okay, that link that I sent you is pretty comprehensive in covering all of the.
Yeah, and we'll put that link in the notes. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, Ramanuja was the founder of Vishishtadvaita philosophy. Okay, so he's around 1,000 years ago, and so you had Nathamuni, and then his grandson Yamunacharya, and then Ramanuja. These three acharyas lived pretty close together in time, like within the span of 200-300 years, and they were, among the big guys. And there's always been an acharya in that lineage. Them are outstanding and did things. So Ramanuja founded Vishishtadvaita, and he also appointed 74 ministers, if you will, for lack of a better term. There's a Sanskrit term for it. But those guys were called Iyengar. And it means they were entrusted with 5 rites or rituals. So anyone from India with the name Iyengar is a descendant of one of those 74 guys that Ramanuja appointed.
Right.
Okay. So each of those 74 went on and the generations passed, and they all had their individual lineages. And as most of them, as far as I know, most of them crumbled and lost their continuity. This Nathamuni Sampradaya is the last unbroken lineage of the Iyengar. And because of the modern world, because everybody wanted to move to America and become an engineer, and the old traditional ways were looked on as being somewhat backwards, and so it was a great sacrifice. And people like Lakshmitatachar and his son, these guys are so brilliant, and they have really a huge intellect. And if they should want to be an engineer or any other thing, they could certainly succeed. But
so they're the last link to Ramanuja. That's
right. That's my understanding.
And I mean, I suppose we could, for the sake of clarification, because I know this stuff, you've done a lot of research and it comes easily to you, but it's kind of complicated for a lot of people, right? Just trying to get their head around this, right? So just asking the questions that might come to someone's mind is like, well, who does Ramanuja, who was he? And the essential question, which we've been circling around and haven't come to yet, is what does he stand for? And therefore, what does Krishnamacharya stand for? How does that inform the worldview of Krishnamacharya? I mean, we know that it says Vishishtha Advaita, so it's qualified dualism.
Yep.
What does all this mean?
What is all of it? Well, I've been working on that forever, and I don't feel even qualified. The more I learn, the less I know. But Ramanuja was, I forget who his acharya was, but he famously defeated his acharya in debate. His acharya was a non-dualist, so his acharya was Advaita, and he defeated him in debate, yelled the secret mantra from the rooftop of the ashram, and had to flee because his loving acharya really wanted to kill him. And So he was in exile for a number of years. 12 of those years he spent in Melkote, which is a village about an hour and a half's drive from Mysore.
Mm.
And that's, there's all sorts of history and stories and stuff that happened there. But he established a very strong ashram there and temple there. And that all still exists. And that's where Tatachar lived. That's where Sri Alwar grew up. And there's a huge connection with the yoga of Mysore and Melkote. So Ramanuja authored this qualified non-dual practice, which is essentially saying, yes, it's all one thing. That's true, but there's some categories. And the famous example is that, you hold a candle and you say, well, this candle is the same thing as the sun. But the candle is not equal to the sun. The candle is little and the sun is big.
Yeah.
So Krishna and Arjuna, when they were having their discussion, Arjuna was not equal to Krishna. They're not they're made of the same thing, but they're not equal. So very, very basically something.
Qualified oneness. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, this philosophy, because I personally, I come from a whole family full of ministers, Christian ministers, and I grew up with the Bible and all of this stuff. So for me, it's very much about looking for the parallels and also the differences in the two systems and trying to understand what these guys are all about. And that's been a beautiful journey. And you don't have to believe somebody else's religion to practice yoga. And you never said that you did. All of these great teachers are simply saying that you got to figure it out for yourself. Life is full of challenges. Everybody dies in the end. Everybody's suffering and everybody's enjoying according to our actions and our karma and so many things. And philosophy is how we deal with our life based on our experience. Svadhyaya is study. And that's part of this story with Patanjali. And that it doesn't just mean read books. It means work on your worldview. Read the great books, look at your life, and say, how does all that apply to my silly little life here? And whenever I'm doing this happens, and why is that? And it's about experience. So you don't have to believe in some particular god or deity.
Do you think it made a difference, though, between, we know Pattabhi Jois was a Shaivite, right? He wasn't part of the Ramanuja lineage. BKS was, obviously, and Iyengar, and TLV was. So Krishnamacharya's viewpoint and the way he related to the yoga he was practicing and teaching, could we say that was different to the way that Pattabhi Jois might have related to it? Could we give any examples of how they might have seen things differently, apart from the qualified oneness of the world? Or would they actually have treated the practice differently or looked upon what they were doing differently in any practical way, we could say?
In terms of, I've thought a lot about this. It's true that all of this, you could just look, the guys with this on their forehead are Vaishnava, and the guys with this on their forehead are Shiva. And there has been a long rivalry there and difference between the two. And so, honest truth is that I don't know. I never had a chance to really study philosophy with Pattabhi Jois. I know that he always gave his credit to Krishnamacharya, and that Krishnamacharya's yoga is considered to be kind of the foundations of modern yoga by many people. When we look at all the people he trained and who they taught, we can say that Krishnamacharya's yoga accounts for asana practice throughout the world, probably a bit more than that, but safely half. But what are the differences in philosophy? Probably, they're they're Shivites, so you can read the Shiva Puranas and you can find some differences. It's kind of like Democrats and Republicans in America. There's really great people on both sides. Like I agree with everybody on some things. But in terms of the practice and what one should do with one's body, no, there's no difference